The final theory that we're going to touch on is the ethics of care. So this is one that's developed in the last 50 years or so, and it's more a reaction to the gaps in the dominant ethical theories that are around. So most of the theories that we've been dealing with deal with logic and reason at their core. Even Aristotle's, to some degree, focused more on the idea of habits and development of the self rather than thinking about others. So in many ways, these are quite what we'd call agentic, which is another word for saying kind of male-focused. And maybe because society and thinking has been dominated by men for so long, that it neglected, say, the communal role or more female-type attributes that we'd associate with decision-making. So that's where the ethics of care comes in. So why don't we have a look at it? So ethics of care suggests that while rational thought and objectivity have been stressed in our approaches, they're largely associated with this one way of thinking about the problems. The key argument of the ethics of care is that connection to others is central to ethics. And you remember, that's where we started out last week by thinking about that relationship between the self, others, and what's right or correct. So it's really emphasizing this relationship between self and others as a key aspect of moral and ethical thinking. So the central premise is that moral action should focus on our relationships and the virtue of care and benevolence. So how do we go actually about applying the ethics of care? Well, rather than what we would do in all the other theories, which is come up with a way of thinking about the problem, in this one we actually ask a series of questions for the specific situation or context we see ourselves in. So a bit like Aristotle's is contextual, the ethics of care goes even further down this path, saying what we need to do can vary greatly by each situation. When we're facing a particular decision or when we need to take a certain action, we ask questions like, is this a just thing to do? Like, is equality being served? How would I feel? What's the right thing to do? Is anyone suffering as a result of this? And the answers to these questions are what should guide our action. As with all ethical approaches, there are key criticisms with that approach. The first one is that it's not universal. So in trying to address the lack of perceived balance in some of these agentic approaches, it has a lack of perceived balance in its approach by focusing on on values we normally associate with one approach, like those communal values. A second key problem that we can have from this theory is this idea of subservience that might arise from it. Because we place the interests and values of the people we're dealing with above ours, we're actually surrendering that self-autonomy and maybe developing subservient traits in ourselves. A third key challenge with the approach is that it doesn't treat people equally. What do we mean by that? Well, because we're thinking about who we affect, it prioritizes those that are close to us and gives them more value than those that are distant. Finally, as a branch of virtue ethics, the ethics of care suffers from the problem that it actually doesn't provide us with a solid guide on what to do, more just a series of questions to help us develop the answers to what we think is ethical. Wow, so there you have it. We've been through 6 different normative models of how to judge whether something that you want to do or decide is ethical. Consequentialist theories of ethics, which focus on the outcome, ethical egoism, utilitarianism. We have those deontological or duty-based approaches coming through from Kant and the moral rights approach. And then finally, virtue ethics, where rather than focusing on the act itself, we focus on what an ethical person would do. Aristotle's approach, and then the ethics of care. And what we have there is I think, a central building block to understand how people come to different conclusions about what the ethical thing to do is. They're actually approaching the problem from quite distinct angles. Is anyone right or wrong? Well, that's up to you, right? Like all of these theories and approaches and normative guidance have their advantages and their disadvantages. But one thing that a number of people find very useful when thinking about ethical problems is to actually use a pluralist approach. So rather than just relying on one specific model to give us an answer, maybe use a few where you get the benefits and avoid the drawbacks of each individual model by using multiple models. Now, that doesn't mean you need to use them like a 3-to-1. If you use 3 models, it's a 2 versus 1. It's not like mathematics like that. Instead, use them to say, look, I've applied this model and to me, it's very clear. I should do this, right? Because a model gives you an answer that to you gives the greatest justification, etc., for the action that you want to take. So getting that idea of pluralism and understanding ethical issues from multiple perspectives is hopefully one of the major things that you can actually take out of the unit. Next week, we move away from ethics and we start thinking about our specific legal system. And we've seen that there's an overlap between the law and ethics, but they're not the same thing. And to get an understanding of what the law is and how it impacts business, we need to start by looking at our legal system, which we look at next week.